Mary Kay, I should make you come up and do it. Hit 3 times? Are you kidding me, 3? Well, I didn't drop it. Good morning. We've survived the hitting the gong 3 times, the hardest part of the service. Welcome to worship with the community of First Unitarian Church of Omaha. My name is Beth Conover, and I'll be serving as your worship associate. The sermon today will be done by our very own long-term member, John Goldner. His sermon is titled, Tales of the Church from the 60s, and we're all looking forward to it. Whether you attend online or in person, I'm glad you've chosen to join us for worship today. I offer up a special welcome to visitors. Let's take a moment to say hello and welcome the people sitting around you. If you're joining us online, we encourage you to say hello and chat with other online attendees. This congregation is an inclusive community that listens, engages, inspires, and acts. Our mission is to foster the whole person with compassion and justice. We are on many journeys, but together we are one church. We are a community of all ages and abilities, with a rainbow of gender and sexual identities and diverse cultural and class backgrounds. We draw from many sources of inspiration and share common liberal religious values. Whoever you may be, we welcome you to bring your whole self into this community. For those online, we also encourage you to use online comments to share joys and concerns that will be lifted up in worship today. For those here in person, you're invited to share coffee and conversation together in the common room downstairs after the service. And Doug Leary-Gear tells me there is a lot of good food down there left over from an event yesterday. So even another reason to join us down there. We have a parking validator in the foyer, so don't miss that if you're parking in the garage. We also affirm that our church occupies the traditional treaty lands of the Omaha and Otoe, Missouri tribal nations whose sovereignty existed long before the state of Nebraska. We express our respect to the Northern Ponca and Winnebago tribes, the Santee Sioux tribe, and other tribes represented in the Omaha area. We invite everyone to go beyond acknowledgments by supporting local causes, charities, and rights of Indigenous people in the area. And now, our prelude. Thank you, Judy. We light the chalice, the symbol of our faith, and our chalice lighter this morning is Kaylin Goldner. As the chalice is lit, I invite you all to join in the chalice lighting words. The second hardest part of the service. Spark of spirit, cupped in earth's embrace, light of love, alive in all creation. As we kindle this flame, we rekindle our connection to the sacred web of life. And Kaylin's also going to light the sabbatical candle. This is the 3rd week of our minister, Reverend Sherry's sabbatical. And we trust that this candle will light her way back to us in November. Now, please join us in a responsive reading number 530 in the Gray Hymnal by Terry Lynn.
Actually, this reading was written by Reverend Robert Weston, who was at one time a minister of this church. And if I'd like you to read the italicized part, and I'll just tell you when it's returned. Out of the stars, their flight, out of the dust of eternity, here we have come, stardust and starlight, mingling through the time and through space. Time out of time before time in the vastness of space, earth spun in the orbit of the sun, earth with thunder of mountains newborn, the boiling of seas.
Earth warmed by sun, lit by sunlight, this is our home. Out of stars have we come.
Mystery hidden in mystery, back through all time. Mystery rising in the rocks, in the storm and the sea. I'm sorry. Yeah. Ponder this thing in your heart. Ponder with awe. Out of the sea to the land. Out of the shallows come ferns.
Out of the sea to the land, up from darkness to light, rising to walk and to fly. Out of the sea trembled life.
Ponder the thing in your heart. Life up from the sea. Eyes to behold, throats to sing, mates to love.
Life from the sea, warmed by sun, washed by rain. Life from within, giving birth to those to love.
This is the wonder of time. This is the marvel of space. Out of the stars swung the earth. Life upon earth rose to love.
This is the marvel of life, rising to see. Out of your heart, our wonders, sing every day.
Thank you, everybody, and I hope you're all looking forward to hearing John as much as I am.
Thank you, Terry Lynn. Oh. Our opening hymn is number 16 in the Gray Hymnal, "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple," one of my favorites, and when you're the worship associate, you get to choose. We're going to go through it twice. It's short.
Ourselves in the light.
Each week, half of the loose currency in the offering plate is donated to a local cause so more people can do good. Our Share of the Plate recipient for July is Omaha for Us, building intentional community and creating equitable space in service of LGBTQ+ individuals and families in the local area. We now enter the part of our service devoted to care and centering. Let us share our joys and concerns. Those online can put items to be shared in the comment area. Colin, do we have anything from online?
Today, this is from Leah Madrasana, and she says, today River celebrates his 21st birthday. From Judy Unger, saying, concern for our friends and neighbors who have refugee status and are now losing the status and being detained and deported, for strength and for hope for them. From Krista Lee Regier, saying, thank you to all who helped to make the celebration of life for my friend Jean McKinney, I don't know, so special. Here yesterday, we will share leftover salads, fruit, and goodies at coffee hour. From Melissa Gibson at Joy, saying, thanks to everyone who came out for the workday yesterday morning. Jonathan, Cooper, Cameron, Everly, Sharon Conlon, John Haruska, Diana and Daniel Bird, Frank Wagner, Mark Leskatoff, and Carolyn McNamara. Next workday is August 23rd. I'll see you there. And visitors are invited to join Melissa Gibson for a new member info session after a service. Grab a cup of coffee in the common room, and the meeting will start at about 10 minutes after a service ends in the Merit Lounge, the room at this way with the couches.
Anyone else? So many joys to see all of you here today. How lovely. John Goldner's a tough draw. Yeah, looking forward to it. Which does bring me to introducing a person who's giving our sermon speech for today, John Goldner, who tells me he has been a member of this church for 61 years. Did I remember that correctly? And I know him professionally as a prominent neurologist here in Omaha, but also as one of those wise people of the congregation, and we are lucky to have a number of them who share their thoughts and wisdom with us. So, John, want to come forward and...
Thank you, Beth. My mother couldn't have said it better. Kaylin and I joined this church in 1961, which, by the way, was the same year that Henry Lemon came to Omaha and joined the church, although Henry had been a Unitarian his entire life. Kaylin and I had not been Unitarians our entire life, but because of this church, we have spent the last 64 years as members and over 63 years as husband and wife, and I feel always beholden to this church simply because it gave me a place that my wife was willing to marry me in. We also have married 3 daughters in this church, so I tell people that I walked up this aisle once and down this aisle 3 times. The genesis of this talk began in about March. For those of you who don't know me very well, and that's most of you, I don't get my purple attendance badge. In fact, I've never gotten my purple attendance badge for attending church every week for a year. But I always come when the choir sings, in large part because if I didn't, I probably wouldn't have Sunday lunch. So I was sitting back in the back where Melissa is sitting right now, which is my favorite chair. Since when Kaylin sings in the choir, I sit alone, and I've always been the kind of person who sits in the back of the class, in large measure because I could rarely contain myself from talking in class, and I had a better shot of the teacher not yelling at me if I sat in the back of the class. Anyway, I was sitting in the back in March, and I noticed the sign for First Steps. And the thought occurred to me that I could give a sermon called Last Steps, because being a member for as many years as we've been here, I'm getting closer to my last steps than I am to my first steps. I volunteered to do that to Reverend Sherry because I figured she had holes to fill. It turns out, of course, that Mary Kay has got the holes to fill. And so I was just volunteering to fill up a Sunday, and I got this. So first, let me say a few words about Henry Lemon, who I knew as a teacher and acquaintance, as a patient, and as a fellow church member. Henry was an amazing person. He came here in 1961 to be the first head of the Epley Cancer Center. And that's really another sermon, because when they started the Epley Cancer Center, cancer was not a specialty in medicine. Everybody thinks that oncology has been around forever, but oncology as a specialty did not begin until the mid-70s. Before that, hematology was a specialty, and hematologists purported to treat leukemia, which was basically untreatable except by nature, and they treated anemias, which were treatable, and then they began to treat a tumor that sort of was on the border between hematology and oncology, and that's Hodgkin's disease. And when Henry came here, there was no oncology, and then Lyndon Johnson did the heart disease, cancer, and stroke bill in, I think, 1964. And that was the beginning of everything in medical research expanding in this country. We're in the process now of seeing medical research unexpand in this country, troubling, but what can you say? In any event, that's how Henry got to Omaha, and Henry stayed. He was the head of Epley only from 61 to 68. And then they brought in a guy from the National Institutes of Health, because by then, all of the grants that were coming to medical schools and universities and research areas were coming from National Institutes of Health, and Henry hadn't been there. Henry had trained in Chicago and in Boston. And so they brought a guy in from National Institutes of Health, and he lived up the street from my folks. I could go into this in some length. Anyway, he was the first of several mistakes that they made at Epley. But by then, Henry was basically treating breast cancer at the university, and he worked there until he retired. When he retired, by then his first wife had died, and he and Dixie had married. They were married for over 20 years. And Henry, and I heard this story from Dixie, on the first morning of Henry's retirement, Henry said to Dixie, Dixie, I need you to type a letter for me. And for those of you who knew Dixie, she rose up. She was an imposing-looking woman, and she was an imposing acting woman because she was an imposing woman. And she stood up and said, Henry, I'm going out for the day. You can type your own damn letter, and if you don't type it, it's not going to get typed in this house. And she left. And by the end of the day, Henry had figured out how to type his letter, and Dixie never typed a letter. Anyway, Henry was a good guy, and one of his great loves was this church, and he was involved in it all the way until the time he died. Now, I will stop with Henry. I will thank 4 people who have put this thing together today. Mary Kay Peters, who I would implore the members of this church to try to help Mary Kay out, because we don't want to burn her out in this sabbatical. And I have seen people, I've been in this church, for 64 years, and I've sat in the back and watched for 64 years, because I have had very little to do with this church. My wife makes up for both of us, but I just sit back there and observe. And one of the things I've observed in this church is how many people we burn out, because when somebody volunteers to do something, we say, go ahead. And then pretty soon they're doing all of it, and then pretty soon they are. A few of them have gone to the Congregational church, but most of them just become unchurched, which, if you ask me, is a really good thing to do, but I'm married to Kaylin, and that's never going to happen to me. Anyway, so, and then I want to thank Melissa for getting me into this thing, but I will start. I'm just going to tell you some stories, and most of them are from the 70s, but the first one is from the 60s, the next 3 are from the 70s, and the last one's from the 80s. And I will try not to go on, although I want to thank Beth for giving me enough time so that I could just mutter on, because it was once said that it takes me 5.5 minutes to say good morning. Because saying good morning always reminds me of a story. And I love to tell stories. I'm the son of a storyteller, and I have some children who are storytellers. And it kind of runs in the family. The first story I want to tell you is my first steps, because Kaylin and I were looking for a place that was satisfactory to both of us. I was raised a Reformed Jew. I was bar mitzvahed. About 4 months after I was bar mitzvahed, my mother felt I should go on and be confirmed, which was 4 more years. My father didn't care what I did. And I decided, since freshman basketball at Central had their games on Saturday morning, and that's when we had the Sunday school, or as we call them, Saturday school classes, that I was going to play basketball. And so the last Saturday that I went to Saturday school, which was in September, the 4 guys that I went to Saturday school with decided we'd have a little going away party for John. So we went out in the street right behind the temple. The temple then was the building that the Greek Orthodox temple is now on 29th and Park Avenue. The Greek Orthodox Church bought it from Temple Israel in 1954. And no, 52, because I was the next to the last person bar mitzvahed in that building. Peter Brodke was last. And so we went out, and we were just messing around, throwing sticks in the air and throwing rocks at each other. And suddenly, the principal of the grade school the church school looked down and said, "My God, they're desecrating the temple." And Rabbi Sidney Brooks, who had been the rabbi for about 3 months then, he only had about 40 more years in him, but we initiated him, and he came running out and started chasing us. And so we all started running for Leavenworth Street, and one guy wouldn't jump over something that you had to jump over to get on the way, and so we all had to come back. And I was expelled from the temple, which I considered kind of a badge of honor. And though my mother frowned at me, my father was kind of pleased. And when the other people were confirmed 4 years later, the other guy who didn't go back, whose dad owned the Dundee Dell bar, the 2 of us went to the confirmation to watch our class be confirmed, but we sat out in the audience. And when I got home that night, there was a beautiful Pendleton shirt that my father gave me as a gift for standing up for my principles. And that confirmed me that I would never be religious in any way again. And I wasn't until I met Kaylin, and then my life changed. For the better, I might add. Anyway, so once we joined this church, we went to the first steps. And other than having since Bob Weston was the minister, he wrote Out of the Stars, but for Robert Weston, I don't know that Kaylin and I would have gotten married, because I couldn't be a Protestant and she couldn't be a Jew, and we weren't sure where in the hell we were going. But what Kaylin knew was we were going somewhere where there was a church that I had to go to every Sunday. And one of my classmate in medical school at that time was a Unitarian. He had, like so many Unitarians, he had worked his way from Catholic to Episcopal to Presbyterian to Unitarian, which is where I was lucky enough to catch him. And then a few years later, he started working his way up the scale again, and he got back to Episcopalian. And anyway, it's a long story. But at the time we needed an answer, he gave us the answer, and we came here. And we met out in the foyer with Reverend Weston, who was only here from 1960 to 1964. He had spent most of his career, he was a Methodist. He'd gone to Iliff in Denver and was a chaplain in World War II. And after World War II, he saw the light and became a Unitarian minister and was in Louisville for probably 15 years before, or almost 15 years before he came here. Anyway, he met us out there and told us he had 2 different wedding ceremonies for mixed marriages. And we said, no, you don't understand. We're here to see if we want to go to your church. Oh, he said. And we immediately became his best friends because he didn't have many people come and say, we want to see your church. So we ended up going here, and I don't know that any of you have ever did have the opportunity to hear Reverend Weston talk, but he was messianic. He was kind of like Nixon in his body build. He had a reasonably sized body, but an out-of-sized face. It was he just had a big head. I don't know if any of you ever saw Nixon, but I stood right next to Richard Nixon once, not because I voted for him, and he had a head that was larger than it should have been for his body, and so did Bob Weston. And Bob Weston he always wore the black robe. He was a minister of the old school, and he'd always get up there in the pulpit to give his sermon, and his sermons were magnificent. And I remember once Kaylin and I came on a snowy Sunday morning. In those days, they didn't call things off because of blizzards, and we came here, and the church was packed. You could hardly drive, but the church was packed, and he got up there and he said, I was going to talk about Kennedy today. Kennedy was president then. Something that President Kennedy did or didn't do. But as I was driving down here, he and his wife lived out on 136th Street. He said, I got to thinking about when I was a kid growing up on a ranch in western Nebraska and what we had to do in the blizzards to go out to get the calves. Because if we didn't get the calves and bring them back to the barn, we were going to lose them in the blizzard. And he talked for 30 minutes about getting those calves. And it was magnificent. I mean, if I hadn't decided I was going to be a Unitarian before, he had me. Those were the kind of sermons he gave. He was a wonderful man. Anyway, he did the first steps. And we met right downstairs, actually, right by the art gallery in the common room. And when Kaylin and I attended, there were about 10 or 12 people. And we sat there, and he was giving us the spiel. And all of a sudden, a guy behind me said, Reverend Weston, I have a question. I have a lot of friends who are Reformed Jews, and I don't know the difference between a Reformed Jew and a Unitarian. We're all liberals, and we're all this, and he went through this whole thing. He says, tell me the difference. And Reverend Weston looked at him and kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, I'm not sure I can answer that question. Could anybody help me? And I raised my hand. I said, that's really very easy, Reverend. And I turned back to the guy and I said, get 2 applications for the Omaha Country Club and write on one of them that your religion is Unitarian and write on the other one that your religion is Jewish and see which one is considered. And which is true. In 1961, couldn't join Happy, couldn't join the Omaha Country Club, couldn't join the Omaha Club. And then, of course, they all started getting into financial difficulty, and then all those barriers broke down. But I had the special privilege of being the first non-Jew to apply for membership at the Highland Country Club. And I want you to know that there was some consideration of not allowing me to get in, even though I was a legacy, because my grandfather had helped start the club and my dad and mom were members. So this was my contribution to First Steps. And that was probably my only contribution until the third story. But the second story is Kaylin and I left in '63, and we went for me to get some training, and we went to Spokane, Washington for a year, and Columbia, Missouri for a couple of years, and then we went to Rochester, Minnesota for 3 years, and everywhere we went, we were members of the Unitarian Church. And since Kaylin was having a child at every stop, we had one in Spokane and one in Columbia and one in Rochester, because it was really inexpensive then. I was an intern and it didn't cost us anything. When we were in Missouri, it cost $25 because I was in the public health service and they had a copay. So the first 3 girls cost me $25. I will tell you, and we came back to Omaha and decided we'd never have any more children. And then I came home one night in the spring of 1971, and here was my wife having cooked dinner for the 3 girls, and they were all off playing, and I usually got home about 7 or 7:30, and she's at the sink washing the dishes of the little girls, and tears are pouring down her face. And I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Well, I saw Larry today. He was her gynecologist." And I thought, "Oh my God, we've got trouble." And I said, "What did Larry say?" And she said, "Well, Larry said I was pregnant." And I looked at her, and with all the finesse that I've always been known to have, and I said to her, "Hey, maybe we can have our son." And she cried for 3 months. Then she stopped crying, delivered him, and it was our son, and the light of her life, as a matter of fact. When David was born, it took a lot of pressure off of me. Anyway, but we came back in '69, and we started coming here to church again, and we discovered that something had happened in the 6 years that we were gone. And what had happened was the first 3 rows of the pews there had been turned from facing north to facing east. And the first 3 rows over there were facing west. So you had almost a theater in the rectangle. And this was down there. And Van Vanstrom was the minister then. Van had come here in '64 to replace Bob and was here until '74. Van was a lawyer. He had been a practicing lawyer before he went into the ministry. And Van was a man of his time. In 1965, Van had gone to Selma and was actually marched with James Reed, who now we have a room named after, the Unitarian minister who was murdered in Selma. And Van was there. And Van was an interesting guy, but he had the pews, and I could never get used to him. But nobody cared. I think the congregation was pretty much split, but the people who were in charge at the time had engineered the move, and so we had the pews facing each other. And when Ron came in, I always thought Ron came in 1975, but he actually candidated in '75, and I think he started January 1st, 1976. And when he came, he was a young minister. He'd come from New England, even though he was from Wisconsin. And he couldn't change this. I mean, he was smart enough not even to try to change it. And the question was, when are we going to get around to having all the pews facing north? And the answer was, when something happens And what happened that drove it was that piano, because that piano was gifted to the church in about 1978, and it was out in the foyer. Well, what in the hell is a piano doing in the foyer? You know, unless it's a bar, you know. And so that led to this, and then eventually this. And so then all the music was down there, but the pipes are still upstairs. Now, it was about that time, actually before Ron came, that we had the first building drive. This building was, as I remember, dedicated in 1917. And by 1975, it was getting fairly shoddy. Not that it isn't shoddy now on the outside, and we've just had a very successful building drive led by Jerry Tritch. And we had people in the past who supported the building of this church: Jamie Alexander, Dean Christensen, Gordon Erickson, Dick Holland, all gave substantial amounts of money to keep the church going. But now the whole congregation chipped in this time, and we're going to have a church around for a while. I volunteered to be on the fund drive committee, one of the few times I ever volunteered. And the reason I volunteered was that Kaylin was very active in, it's always Kaylin. There's, quite frankly, other than for golf and for going to work every day, everything in my life has revolved around Kaylin for 63 years. So in any event, Kaylin was very active in Girl Scouts then. The Girl Scouts got their money from United Way, and United Way was beginning to have trouble giving enough money to all of their organizations to keep them going, because one of the rules with United Way was if you took United Way money, you couldn't have your own campaign. And so they changed that, and Kaylin was the head of the first Friends of Girl Scouting in Omaha, their first campaign, I don't know, 74, 75, whatever. All I know is that she said to me, "Could you help?" And the answer was, "Yes, dear." And so I became the guy who went out to raise money from doctors. And I had never tried to raise money from doctors before. And it was a real eye-opener, an awakening, as you might say, because I realized these people, and most of them were guys then, are the cheapest people I've ever met. You know, the ones who had daughters wouldn't give me any money, but I knew damn well that the ones who had daughters were giving money to the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts didn't have any trouble collecting money from the doctors, but the Girl Scouts couldn't. Now that about 40% of the doctors in America are women, I think the Girl Scouts could probably do better, but we only, for the most part, only had male grandchildren. So I never had to worry about Girl Scouts again. Anyway, I tell you this story because it was one of the few times, well, it was the only time I was supposed to go out and raise money from Dick Holland. Now, Dick Holland, this was 1975, and Berkshire was at $50 a share. So it wasn't as good as AT&T. And so I went to Dick Holland, who lived on 80th Street, where he lived until the day he died. And I went over there and I asked him for a gift, and he said, "What are you giving?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, I'll give what you're giving." I probably solicited Dick Holland another 10 or 12 times in his life, and he never asked me that question again. And he was very, very generous. At the same time, in this church, but not of this church, there was the Midwest Memorial Society. The Midwest Memorial Society was run by a lady named Gracie Scudder, and she was a phenomenon. She was, maybe 5'2", 5'3", and she was into everything. Gracie was the kind of person that made you lightheaded when you looked at her from 40 feet, because she was always doing something. And she had all sorts of ideas. And as so often happens, she was married to a guy, old Charlie Scudder, who was a giant. He was about 6'3", great big guy with a big thatch of white hair, and he always sat down there in the front row of the church and smiled and laughed and never did a thing. And Gracie did all the work. It was kind of like our marriage. But Gracie started the Midwest Memorial Society. The office for the Midwest Memorial Society was right over there, right where the church office has always been. It's the same phone number, it was the same telephone, it was answered by the same person, but it had nothing to do with the church. And it had only one purpose, and that was to bring cremation to Omaha. Now, that's hard to believe, but in the 1970s in Omaha, you couldn't be cremated because none of the mortuaries would do it. And, it's one thing to burn leaves in your front yard, but you don't want to start doing cremations out there. And you had to go to Council Bluffs to get cremated. And so Gracie was going to change that. And it turns out that, and Gracie wanted a doctor on her board. And at that time when we were here, there were 8 or 10 doctors who were members of this church, and none of them would do it. And we got back, we're easy. And so Gracie asked us if we would be on her board, and I agreed, and I thought, I wonder what I'm going to have to do. And the answer is, all I did was sell my name for nothing, and our name was on her letterhead, and that was it. I never had to do a thing. The person who saved Midwest Memorial Society was a guy named Boyd Brayman. Boyd Brayman was a mortician, and he worked for somebody in Council Bluffs, and he knew all about cremation. And so, I don't know, what was that? There was a short order place from Lincoln. Yeah, anyway, they had restaurants. No, it wasn't Grandma's. They stayed in business, more or less. But this was a huge chain that started in Lincoln. It was all over the Middle West, and it went broke. And Boyd Brayman came over here in about King's Food Host USA. That's what it was, King's Food Host USA. And they had one on 72nd Street, kind of just north of Creighton Prep on the west side of the street. And Boyd bought it. It was all glass. So Boyd just put dark brown wood, enclosed the whole thing in dark brown wood. There were no windows anymore. And that became his first mortuary. But Boyd would do cremation. Within 1 year, and I know this for a fact because when my mother died in 1969, we couldn't have her cremated, and when my father died in 1980, we could at then Crosby Cunnell, and it was because once one mortician was offering cremation, they all had to do it, and they all did, and now my friend Bill Cutler at Heafy and Heafy, and they have a bed waiting for me there, tells me that about 35% of funerals now, of people who die, are cremated in Omaha. And in a sense, Gracie Scudder was the mother of this whole thing in Omaha, although Boyd Bremen is the one who made it work. Boyd has joined the Saints since then, and now every mortuary in Omaha is owned by a national company, except for Heafy and Heafy, and for one other. Oh, Roeder's, Ron Roeder's place. His son still owns that. So that gets us through the 70s. In the 80s, we had the thing that I've always felt was sort of the seminal moment in convincing me that I had made the right choice for me in belonging to this church. We have had members in this church from Offutt for as long as I can remember. I mean, I remember once the weatherman from Offutt was a member, and I loved to go down and hear his stories downstairs about generals' wives and wanting to know what the weather was going to be like in 6.5 months because they wanted to have an outside wedding for their daughter, and these were the kind of things he dealt with. But once upon a time, from 1986 to 1991, General John Chain Jr. was the commanding general of SAC. To be a commanding general, you got to have 3 stars on each shoulder. Now, I don't know if you know about generals, but a 1-star general is a guy who kind of sucked up to the people above him, and so instead of being a full bird colonel, he's a 1-star general. It's not a lot of difference. You get to be a 2-star general, a major general, and now you're a little bit important. You were able to express your opinion to your superiors when asked. If you're a 1-star general and they ask you your opinion, the best answer is, "I'm not sure, sir." And for a 2-star general, you can give an answer. For a 3-star general, you run things. For a 4-star general, you are now a general of the armies, and a 5-star general, you're Eisenhower. So Chain was a 3-star general. But what made him unique was that he was a Unitarian and had always been a Unitarian. And he was in his 50s then. And we found out about it. Ron Knapp was the minister then. He didn't join the church, but we knew we had a Unitarian down there in Bellevue. And in those days, we had a forum here. Now, once upon a time, in the 50s, there were the Hoagland lectures. And then in the 90s, there were the Holland lectures. And these were sort of outside deals. I mean, anybody came. And the Holland lectures were always elsewhere. I think the Hoagland lectures were downstairs or up here. But we had a forum in the 80s, and it was not every week, and it was from 9:30 to 10:30 downstairs. Then we'd have coffee, and then we'd come upstairs for the service at 11. And somebody got General Chain to agree to give a forum. And I was kind of excited. And so was the rest of the church, because we had that common room packed with all those chairs, the folding chairs. And then the rest of us were standing up. And General Chain came. He was talking about atoms for peace, an appropriate subject at a Unitarian church, as opposed to atoms for war, which is what he spent most of his life doing. But he started to talk, and this was, I believe, I can't remember whether Reagan was president or George Herbert Walker Bush was president when Chain talked, but it was right in there. And things were troubled. I don't know that we had gone to war in the Middle East yet. and we had certainly gotten out of Vietnam. But there were a lot of people in this church who were opposed to the military. Imagine that. And they all came. And I think General Chain, who was used to being in command, I mean, he was a chief officer of SAC, and he started giving his talk, all prepared. I remember, it seems to me he was in fatigues as opposed to his dress uniform. He wasn't in a dress uniform. He started giving his talk, and people started asking him questions literally within the first 5 minutes of the talk. And at first, he very patiently answered them. And then the questions became a little more stinging, and he tried to patiently answer them. And then the questions became downright nasty. And finally, General Chain had decided he had had all the fun that morning he was going to have. So we got to have about a 50-minute coffee instead of a 30-minute coffee, and General Chain got his papers together. His aide came running up, because you always have an aide, and off they went. And I'm not sure that I was ever prouder to be a member of this church than the day we ran John Chain out of here. I have more stories, but the time has come, and as Rudyard Kipling always said in the Jungle Books, that's a story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think we need another one of these, 80s forward. Okay, our closing hymn is number 114 in the Gray Hymnal, a favorite of Ron Knapp's, Forward Through the Ages. As we go forth, I offer you this final blessing attributed to Kalidasa. Look to this day, for it is life, the very life of life. In its brief course lie all the verities and realities of your existence, the bliss of growth, the glory of action, and the splendor of beauty. For yesterday is but a dream, and tomorrow is only a vision. But today, well lived, makes every yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Look well, therefore, to this day.